The teacup still sits where it fell that night, its porcelain cracked down the side like a quiet scream frozen in time. I've left it there, on the corner shelf, not out of forgetfulness, but as a reminder. It was the cup I was holding when she slapped me, right in front of our dinner guests. But it wasn't her hand that shattered something inside me, it was the silence that followed. No one gasped. No one spoke. And in that heavy quiet, I understood something. I didn't belong there anymore. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Comment below. I was 73 when I moved in with them. My son, Mark, and his wife, Tina. It wasn't out of desperation, not then. I still had my strength, still woke up early to make oatmeal from scratch and sweep the porch before the sun got too warm. But after Harold passed, the house became too quiet. The silence echoed louder than his absence, and the winters felt longer than before. Mark had offered, kindly at first, to come live with them. "You'll have your own room, Ma. You'll never have to cook again." That was his way of making it sound like a gift, a kindness. And for a while it was. The house was bigger than mine, 2 stories with a modern kitchen and hardwood floors that clicked under my slippers. They'd renovated it not long before I moved in. New counters, fresh paint, even a little reading nook by the window upstairs. I had used my savings to help with the renovation. Not much, just what was left of Harold's pension and a few thousand I'd saved from teaching piano lessons over the years. "You'll enjoy the upgrades too," Tina had said when I handed her the check. I thought that made it ours, at least a little. At first, things were warm. Tina smiled more often, and Mark would check in on me after work, patting my shoulder like I was made of feathers. I picked up the grandkids from school when Tina was running late, baked cookies on Fridays, and knitted scarves when winter peeked through the windows. I didn't mind it, being useful. It felt like home again in a way. But slowly, little things began to shift. Tina started using the word "my" when talking about the house. "My kitchen's a mess. I need to repaint my guest bathroom." I noticed it, the way one notices a cold draft in a warm room. Not enough to shiver, but enough to know something had changed. Mark, sweet but distant, always seemed to sidestep anything uncomfortable. He'd pat my hand and say, "Just ignore it, Ma. Tina doesn't mean anything by it." Maybe she didn't at first. I began waking up earlier than usual, just to have the kitchen to myself. I missed the quiet rhythm of making breakfast, measuring flour, whisking eggs, waiting for coffee to brew while the sun stretched through the curtains. But that space, too, became something I tiptoed around. Tina would sigh loudly if I left crumbs on the counter or rearranged the mugs. She started buying new plates, modern ones, and slowly moved my floral pattern dishes to the back of the cupboard. I found them one day, wrapped in newspaper, shoved behind a box of holiday decorations. "Maybe it's time to let some old things go," she said, not unkindly but firmly. So I let them go. I let a lot of things go. My room was at the end of the hall, small but enough. I kept my husband's picture by the bed, he in his Sunday suit, smiling with eyes that always seemed to see me. I talked to him sometimes, especially when the house felt colder. I'd whisper updates, little things. "Tina wants to repaint the living room again," or "the twins made honor roll." They were good kids, the twins, Eli and Sarah. They'd sit with me after school, asking for stories about the old days. I'd tell them about iceboxes and rotary phones, how Harold once drove 20 miles just to surprise me with pie. They laughed easily back then, their eyes wide, still unspoiled by grown-up rules. Thanksgiving was the only time the house truly felt like it belonged to all of us. I'd cook my famous stuffing, and Tina would allow me her kitchen for one day. Mark would string up lights, and the grandkids would help me fold napkins into shapes that never quite held. We'd sit around the long oak table, the one Harold built with his own hands, and for a few hours, the air would be full of warmth and cinnamon. But even those moments began to fade. One Christmas, I offered to host a carol night like we used to. Tina said it was too much mess and too old-fashioned. I nodded and smiled, folding the sheet music back into the drawer where it sat untouched. The house grew quieter with each passing season, not with peace, but with distance. My place in it became less defined. I started noticing how Tina introduced me at gatherings, not as Mom or Ma, but as Mark's mother. Always with a tight smile, always just enough warmth to keep it civil. Guests would glance my way, polite but brief. I'd sit quietly, hands folded in my lap, pretending not to notice when conversations moved past me. I still paid the taxes. Mark didn't know that. I handled the paperwork quietly, out of habit, out of duty. When Harold and I first bought the house, yes, it had been ours before we handed it to Mark, we had agreed that a home was a legacy. Something to pass down, not just bricks and walls, but stories, roots. So I kept the name on the deed, though I never spoke of it. Mark once joked that he'd never need to worry about retirement because this house is our nest egg. I smiled then, but something inside me paused. It wasn't until I overheard Tina on the phone one afternoon that the pause turned into something else. She was speaking quickly, sharply. I don't care what she thinks, it's our house now. She's lucky we let her stay. She laughed, and something in that laugh peeled something away from me. A layer of patience. A layer of hope. I stood by the stairwell, holding a basket of folded towels. Not moving. Not breathing. Just listening to the sound of my own heart, quiet and disappointed. I went to my room and pulled out the deed that evening. My name was still there. Plain and legal. Not out of pride, but out of love for what Harold and I had built. Something told me then that it might matter one day. And so I began waiting. Waiting for the moment when silence would no longer mean surrender. Waiting for the quiet shift where I'd stop asking for space and start claiming it. But even then, even in all that stillness, I hadn't imagined it would begin with a slap. It didn't happen all at once. That's how they make you feel foolish. By stretching the small cruelties so thin, so slow, you begin to doubt they ever happened at all. At first, it was just the way Tina would sigh whenever I entered the room, like my presence made the air heavier. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe she was tired, I reasoned. Raising twins and managing a house is no small task. I had done it once, I remembered, though no one seemed to think that counted anymore. Then came the corrections. I already salted that, she'd say when I reached for the shaker. We don't let the kids have sweets before dinner. Even though I'd only offered one little peppermint. I told myself again, don't take it personally. These things happen in shared homes. Generations clash. That's what the magazines say, isn't it? But then came the whispers. I'd hear them in the hallway late at night, Tina's voice sharp and low, Mark's murmuring in response. My name never said outright, but the tone unmistakable. She just rearranged the fridge again. I don't think she understands boundaries. She's always around, as if my existence was an inconvenience, an echo they couldn't turn off. I began to change my routines. Woke up even earlier. Ate breakfast standing by the window so I wouldn't leave crumbs at the table. I folded laundry quietly and left it on the edge of their bed, never stepping in. I didn't want to intrude. I only wanted to belong. Just a little. The kids still visited me, still asked for stories and helped me with my puzzles. But even that started to shift. Tina would call them from the doorway. That's enough time. Come help with dinner. They'd glance back at me, uncertain, before slipping away like light under a closing door. One afternoon, I offered to pick them up from school like I always had. Tina looked up from her phone and said, "Actually, I've got it today. I think it's time they spent more time with us." Us. Not we. Not family. So I stayed home, baked a batch of banana bread that sat untouched on the counter for 2 days before I finally wrapped it up and gave it to the mailman. It wasn't just emotional, either. Physical space began to shift. The pantry was reorganized without telling me. My favorite teacups replaced with plain white ones. My sewing kit moved to the garage, inside a box labeled Ma Stuff. And my name, it started disappearing. The utility bills no longer had my name printed. Packages stopped coming to Margaret. Even the Christmas stockings, hand-stitched by me years ago, were replaced with store-bought ones. My old red one, with the little green bell, was quietly folded and placed in the attic. I found it one day, in a plastic bin marked Old Decorations. I held it in my lap, tracing the stitches. It still smelled faintly of cinnamon and fireplace ash. I didn't cry. Not then. But I folded it back up, gently, like something sacred that no longer had a place on the mantel. Mark, he noticed less and less. Or maybe he chose not to. He worked long hours and came home tired. I'd offer him tea, and he'd say, "Thanks, Ma," but his eyes stayed on his phone. Sometimes I'd try to bring up the little things, how Tina seemed tense, or how the kids seemed distant. He'd smile, distracted, and say, "You're overthinking. Things are fine." Things were not fine. The final small cut came one rainy morning. I had spent hours preparing soup, chicken noodle, the kind Mark loved as a boy. I set the table, lit a little candle in the middle like I used to during stormy days. Tina walked in, glanced at the setting, and said, "Oh, we're going out tonight. Mark didn't tell you." I hadn't cooked in weeks. That soup was my way of trying just one more time. I looked at her, unsure of what to say. "It's just we have plans, that's all," she added, softer but not sorry. They left before the candle even finished burning down. I sat at the table and watched the rain slide down the window. The soup went cold in the bowls. Even the silence felt embarrassed to be there. I remember going to bed that night with a strange stillness inside me. Not anger, not even sadness. Just weight. Like something was pressing gently on my chest. Like truth finally found a place to sit. This was no longer my home. Not in the way it used to be. I was not wanted, not truly. And yet, I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe because leaving felt like surrender. Maybe because I believed love could still stretch across the cold. Maybe because I hadn't yet looked at the deed. That moment would come. But before it did, I had to first feel the quiet unraveling of what I had once called family. The kind of unraveling that doesn't snap like a rope, but frays slowly until nothing holds. It was a Saturday evening in late October, one of those chilly nights when the air clings to your sweater and smells faintly of wood smoke and coming winter. Tina had planned a dinner party for some of Mark's colleagues, polished people, with neat collars and tight handshakes. The kind who smiled just enough to be polite, but never quite enough to be warm. I had spent the day ironing napkins and polishing the silverware, quietly, in the background, as I often was. I didn't mind. Hosting used to bring me joy. It reminded me of the days when Harold and I would throw small get-togethers with neighbors, passing casseroles and stories across the table. Those memories still flickered like candlelight behind my eyes. Tina didn't ask for my help, but I gave it anyway, setting the table just the way I knew Mark liked it growing up, folding the corners of the napkins inward like a flower. She came in as I was lighting the last candle and paused. "I already had a theme," she said flatly. "This doesn't match." I blinked. "Oh, I just thought." She turned away mid-sentence, muttering something under her breath I couldn't quite catch. I told myself to step back, just stay out of the way. So I retreated to the edge of the room once the guests arrived, wearing my soft lavender sweater, the one Sarah had said made me look like a lilac bush in bloom. They laughed and clinked glasses, the sound of confidence and comfort. I sat quietly near the hallway, sipping warm water, waiting for a moment when I might slip into conversation, just a comment, a smile, something to tether me to the room. But none came. Then I noticed the teacups, my old porcelain set. The ones Tina had packed away months ago. She'd brought them out, without saying a word, matching them to her floral centerpiece. They were part of the aesthetic now, useful only when they suited the image. I stood up, quietly, and walked over to the tray to help serve the tea. It was something I'd done hundreds of times, graceful, practiced, comforting. I poured with care, hands steady even after all these years. One of the guests complimented the cups. "These are lovely," she said. I smiled, softly. They were a wedding gift. 47 years ago. Tina stiffened. "They were my mother's," she replied quickly, forcing a laugh. "She lets us borrow them sometimes." It was so casual, so smooth. As if I were nothing more than a footnote in the room, a vague relative who lent things now and then. My mouth opened slightly, but I didn't speak. Instead, I turned to offer a cup to the woman nearest me. but the saucer slipped just a little and the cup wobbled. I caught it, but a few drops of tea splashed onto the white tablecloth. It was barely noticeable, but Tina saw it. She stepped forward, fast, smiling, still smiling, and reached for my wrist, her voice sugary and sharp. "Let me," she said, snatching the teapot from my hands. And then it happened. Her hand brushed against my arm too hard, not a push, not quite, but firm enough to startle me. My other hand knocked against the tray. A teacup fell. Porcelain hit hardwood, cracked loud and sudden. The room went still. And then her hand, open, swift, struck my cheek. Not hard enough to bruise. Just enough to humiliate. It wasn't rage. It was control. A gesture as tidy as her centerpieces. "Oh my God, she started, her voice fake with concern. "I didn't mean," she just. But no one moved. The guests looked at their plates, their cups, their laps. One man cleared his throat. Another sipped his drink. And my son, Mark, he stood by the fireplace silent. His eyes met mine. And then he looked away. I bent down, not to cry, not to run, but to pick up the broken teacup. My hands shook only slightly as I gathered the pieces, placing them in a napkin. I didn't speak. No one did. I walked slowly to the hallway, the napkin held close to my chest. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and unwrapped the shards onto the quilt. They were still warm. A thin line of tea had soaked into the cloth like a small, fading wound. I touched my cheek. It didn't sting. Not physically. But inside, something splintered. It wasn't the slap that hurt the most. It was what it revealed. That I could be struck, in front of witnesses, and no one would stand. That I could be erased with a lie about teacups, and no one would correct it. That I could pour love, service, care, and still be invisible. And worse, disposable. I sat there long into the night. The broken cup beside me. The taste of shame sharp in my mouth. I thought of Harold. Of how he would have stood between me and any harm. Not with shouting, but with quiet certainty. I missed him fiercely then, not just his presence, but the dignity he gave me simply by being beside me. And that night, as the laughter resumed downstairs, thin and forced, I made a decision. Not out of anger, not even out of grief, but because something inside me finally stood up. Quietly, still, but unshakable, as just avoiding the hallway that passed my room. I rose at dawn, as I always did, and made myself a cup of tea, not with the porcelain set, but an old mug I'd brought with me when I moved in. It had a chip near the rim and said "World's Best Grandma" in faded pink. It was a lie now, I supposed, or at least something Tina wouldn't say out loud. I carried it to my room and closed the door gently. My cheek no longer hurt, but I could still feel the sting of it, not on my skin, but somewhere deeper, like an echo inside my chest. I sat on the bed and pulled out the old metal box from beneath it, the one Harold had kept his important papers in. It smelled faintly of cedar and age. Inside were birth certificates, savings bonds, and a crisp white envelope that held the deed to the house. Our house. My name, printed beside Harold's, stared back at me like an old friend who had been quietly waiting for me to remember her. I ran my fingers over the ink, slow and careful, as if touching it could steady me. I had never removed myself from the document. Not out of stubbornness, just habit. The house had always been ours. Even when we gave it to Mark, we left things as they were, unofficially. The paperwork was never transferred. Tina never asked. That small legal detail, forgotten by them but preserved by me, now felt like a flame in a dark room. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. But I did feel grounded. Like the earth beneath my feet had shifted back into place after years of wobbling. I folded the deed and placed it back in the box, careful not to crease it. Then I reached for a notepad and pen, the simple kind you keep near the phone, and began to write. Not a plan. Not a revenge plot. Just steps. Things I needed to check. People I needed to call. Questions I needed to ask. I wrote the lawyer's name, Joseph Whitaker. He had been a friend of Harold's, someone we'd met at church potlucks and community board meetings. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I remembered his kindness. I circled his name, then paused and added, quietly, without telling Mark. Because this wasn't about confrontation. It was about clarity. I made a list of items I wanted to take if I ever left: family photos, Harold's Bible, the quilt my mother stitched when I was born. I walked through the house slowly that afternoon, making mental notes, touching the walls with a kind of farewell that wasn't yet goodbye. I didn't speak to Mark. He didn't seek me out either. We passed each other in the hallway once. He looked tired, older somehow. His eyes met mine, and there was something in them, remorse perhaps, but he said nothing. And neither did I. There was no apology from Tina. No mention of the slap. She carried on as if nothing had happened. That was her way. Control, through dismissal. She smiled during dinner, complimented the twins' schoolwork, and walked past me like I was a coat rack, there but irrelevant. But something had changed. Not in them, in me. I no longer looked for a seat at the table. I no longer measured my worth by their glances or silences. I simply watched, observed, learned. And slowly, I began to act. I gathered my records, social security statements, pension details, my marriage certificate. I arranged them in a folder and labeled it personal. I took it to the library one morning, where I made copies and scanned them to a USB drive I kept in my purse. The young librarian smiled at me and said, "You're really organized." I smiled back and said nothing. At home, I stopped trying to be helpful. I let Tina load the dishwasher her way. I didn't fold the laundry. I no longer offered to cook or pick up the kids. I simply withdrew. Not out of bitterness. Out of purpose. I read more. Sat outside longer. Wrote in a small leather-bound journal that had belonged to Harold. In it, I recorded memories, thoughts, prayers. Not to share, but to remind myself that my life had weight. That I had mattered. That I still did. I remembered something my grandmother once said. Silence isn't weakness, child. It's a waiting room for strength. I was beginning to understand what she meant. Each quiet hour became a stone in a path I was laying, steady and slow. I didn't rush. I didn't fume. I simply continued. Continued gathering what was mine. Continued building the bridge back to myself. By the end of the week, I had called Joseph. His voice was gentle, curious. I told him I needed to go over a deed, and that I preferred not to involve my family. He didn't ask why. Just said, "Of course. Come in Monday." I hung up the phone and sat for a long while, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. I wasn't angry. I was becoming ready. For what? I wasn't fully sure yet. But I knew this. I would never again beg to belong in a place I helped build. And if I had to start over, I would do so with quiet hands, carrying nothing but the truth. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Let me know in the comments. Monday morning came with a soft drizzle, the kind that doesn't demand an umbrella but still manages to settle into your sleeves and stay. I woke before the sun, made myself oatmeal in the quiet kitchen, and slipped on my raincoat. No one else was awake. The hallway lights were dim, and the house hummed with stillness. I walked the 2 blocks to the bus stop, my leather handbag tucked close under my arm, the folder inside dry and warm. It was the same bag I carried the day Harold and I closed on the house, decades ago. I remember he held my hand as we signed the papers, proud and nervous. We were younger than Mark is now. I smiled at the memory, my breath fogging the morning air. Joseph Whitaker's office was small and warm, tucked between a florist and a bakery that smelled of rising dough. He looked older than I remembered, white hair now and reading glasses perched low on his nose, but his eyes were still kind. He stood when I walked in. "Margaret," he said, offering both hands. "It's been too long." I sat across from him, the leather chair creaking beneath me. I placed the folder on his desk without a word. He opened it slowly, scanning the deed, then looking up at me. "You're still the legal owner," he said after a moment. "It was never transferred to Mark." "I know," I whispered. "I want to sell it." He raised his eyebrows slightly, but didn't question me. Only nodded. "I can help with that," he said gently. "But You understand what that means for your family? I looked down at my hands, still wrapped around the strap of my purse. It's not a family anymore. Not really. He didn't ask anything further. The process began quietly. Joseph connected me with a real estate agent he trusted, an older woman named Diane who didn't wear too much perfume and had a voice that made you feel like you were being tucked in under a warm quilt. I met her twice, both times outside the house while Mark and Tina were at work. She walked through the rooms, took pictures discreetly, and asked thoughtful questions. "Do you want me to speak with your family about showings?" she asked one afternoon. "No," I said simply. "I'll let you know when the time is right." She nodded. "We'll start with private listings then." Quiet interest. No public signs. I was grateful for her discretion. At home, things carried on as usual. Or so it seemed on the surface. Tina continued her rehearsed kindness, smiles that never touched her eyes, compliments that came with conditions. Mark stayed in his usual orbit. Work, TV, sleep. The children seemed more subdued, as if sensing something in the air but unable to name it. I began to box up my belongings. Not hurried, not rushed. Just one drawer at a time. I donated some clothes, packed others into small suitcases. My wedding photo, the lace doily Harold's mother crocheted, the music box I used to wind for Sarah when she had trouble falling asleep, all quietly wrapped in towels and placed in a trunk at the foot of my bed. In the evenings, I'd sit in the backyard, wrapped in a shawl, and sip my tea. The autumn wind rustled the leaves above me, and every now and then, I'd hear laughter from inside. It didn't make the way it used to. I was starting to feel like a guest in someone else's story, and I had no intention of staying for the final chapter. One evening, Mark came into my room. He stood awkwardly near the door, glancing at the boxes along the wall. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked. I looked up from my book. "Just organizing." He nodded slowly. "Tina says you've been quiet lately." I didn't answer. He shifted. "She's sorry, about what happened that night." I looked at him, carefully. "Is she?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. "We've all been under a lot of stress." I nodded. "Yes. I imagine you have." He didn't stay long after that. Just enough to ease his own conscience, perhaps. Or maybe he sensed what was coming and didn't want to see it forming in my eyes. A week later, Joseph called. "There's a solid offer, Margaret. Clean terms. No complications." I listened to his voice like it was coming from far away. "You can accept it or wait. Up to you." I paused, then said, "Accept it." That night, I sat by the window and watched the moon rise above the sycamore tree. I thought of Harold again, of how we'd once painted the shutters blue and argued gently about the flower beds. I whispered a quiet thank you to him, to the younger version of me who had insisted on keeping her name on that deed. It wasn't about power. It wasn't even about the house. It was about not being erased. The next morning, I wrote a letter to Mark. Not bitter, just clear, explaining what had been done, why it had to be done, and what came next. I left it on his dresser before sunrise. Then I walked outside, pulled my cardigan close, and felt, for the first time in a long time, free. The morning after I left the letter on Mark's dresser, I found myself sitting at the edge of my bed, the soft creak of the mattress beneath me the only sound in the room. The house was still asleep. I had time before the weight of reactions would come knocking. So I opened the drawer in my nightstand and pulled out something I hadn't touched in years, a faded photograph, corners curled, colors softened by time. It was a picture of me and my mother-in-law, Alma, standing on the porch of this same house, back when Harold and I were newly married. She had her arms stiffly around my shoulder. I wore a dress 2 sizes too big, gifted to me by her with a smile that never reached her eyes. Alma never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her disappointment was doled out in silences and glances. She believed in order, in quiet control. When I moved in after our wedding, she made it known that her home was still hers, even if Harold paid the mortgage. She left no room for my opinion. Not in the kitchen, not in the way towels were folded, not even in how I dressed. "I wouldn't wear that color," she'd say lightly, as if I had asked. "You put too much salt in. after I'd made the stew. "It's fine," she'd say often. That kind of fine that meant it wasn't. I had no mother of my own then. She died when I was 16, and my father was already gone before I was old enough to remember his face. Alma was the only maternal figure I had left. I craved her approval, tried to earn it with baked bread, ironed shirts, spotless floors. But her kindness, if it ever existed, was saved for neighbors and church ladies. I remember once, just months after Harold and I moved in, I tried to plant flowers in the front yard. Daisies and bluebells, ones I bought with a little of my own grocery money. I was kneeling in the dirt, humming to myself, when Alma stepped onto the porch. She looked down at the flowers, then at me. "You'll make the yard look messy," she said. "People talk, you know." That evening, she dug them up. I found them in a bucket beside the trash. Harold had tried. He'd speak to her, gently. But he was her son, and I learned quickly how that bond outweighed reason. He loved me, but he had been raised in her silence. I told myself then, when I grow old, I'll never make anyone feel like this. My home will be open. My arms will be kind. My words will build, not shrink. And for a long time, I kept that promise. When Mark was born, I read to him every night, even when I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I packed his lunches with notes, signed with hearts. I clapped the loudest at his school plays, even when he forgot his lines. When he fell in love with Tina, I tried. I opened my home, my wallet, my time. I welcomed her, even when she looked through me. I told myself I would never be like Alma. But somewhere, without realizing, I began to play the same part, different words, same ache. Not by cruelty, but by silence. By not standing up when I should have. By letting myself become invisible. Again. That realization came sharp and clear as I held the photo in my hands that morning. It wasn't just Tina's slap that broke me. It was the echo of Alma's voice all those years ago. The slow unraveling of my own voice, my own self-worth, thread by thread. I had spent my life trying not to become her. But I had also spent it waiting for others to treat me better, instead of remembering that I could choose to treat myself better. Alma died a quiet death in the upstairs room of a nursing home. I visited her every week, even when she no longer remembered my name. I combed her hair. I read to her. I held her hand. She never apologized. But I had forgiven her, long before she forgot me. Because forgiveness wasn't for her. It was for me. So I wouldn't carry her coldness into my final chapters. Now, as I stared at that old photo, I felt something shift inside. I folded it neatly and placed it in my bag, not out of nostalgia but as a reminder. A quiet token of who I had been, and who I refused to become. I stood and opened the curtains. The morning light was soft and blue, the sky still waking. I heard footsteps stirring down the hall. Mark, probably, and I knew that soon, words would be spoken, faces would change. The letter would be read. The weight would arrive. But I was no longer afraid of it. Because I had already walked through the storm. I had already lived through the kind of silence that teaches you how to breathe differently, how to stand without applause, how to speak even when no one is listening. I had loved people who didn't love me back the way I needed. I had stayed quiet long enough to know what it costs. And now, finally, I was beginning to choose myself, not out of spite, but out of long overdue grace. As I walked into the hallway that morning, my steps felt different, slower but not hesitant. For the first time in a long while, I was moving forward. Not away from anyone, but toward something. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I found it. Tina was out yoga class, I think, and the house was unusually quiet. Mark had left early for work. The children were at school. I had finished folding a basket of towels and was putting them away in the hallway linen closet when something slipped off the top shelf and landed at my feet. A folder. Plain manila. No label. I bent slowly, knees stiff, and picked it up. It wasn't mine. At first, I meant to place it back where it belonged, tuck it away without a glance. But the corner had torn slightly, and I could see the edge of a typed document inside. Familiar words, sharp and black on white. I brought it to my room. I shouldn't have. I know that. But something inside me, something old and aching, said look. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the flap further. Inside were printed emails, housing documents, notes scribbled in Tina's round, neat handwriting. I read the first page, and my breath caught halfway in my throat. Transfer of ownership upon vacating, new deed proposal. It took me a moment to fully understand. They were planning to remove me. Quietly. Legally. One of the emails, sent from Tina's account to a realtor, read, "Once we finalize things, she'll move into a care facility. She's getting more confused lately. We're doing what's best." A care facility. Confused. The words wrapped around my heart like cold wire. I turned the page with trembling fingers. There it was, an unsigned draft of a new deed, with Tina and Mark's names listed under owners. Mine was absent. Completely gone. As if I had never existed here. As if the walls hadn't echoed with my lullabies, my prayers, my love. As if Harold and I hadn't built this life with our hands and hopes. They had been planning it. Not just Tina. Mark too. My own son. My chest felt hollow, like a room emptied of its furniture, echoing with the absence of love. I closed the folder and sat still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of a truck outside. That was the moment. The true betrayal. Not the slap. Not the silence. But the quiet, calculated plan to erase me from the home I still owned. They thought I was confused. They were counting on it. Using my age, my quiet, my trust. Calling it kindness while arranging my removal like a business deal. I opened my dresser drawer, pulled out the deed again. I held it beside their draft. The contrast was almost cruel. The boldness of their assumption that I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't understand. I did understand. I understood everything. This house, this life, they had mistaken my silence for senility. My stillness for surrender. I placed the folder back on the shelf, just as I had found it. I didn't confront them. Not yet. That would have been giving them the noise they expected. The mess. The confirmation that I didn't know how to handle myself. Instead, I went outside. I sat on the back porch and looked at the tree Harold planted when Mark was born. It had grown tall, branches stretching wide like arms ready to embrace. I remember us tying a little blue ribbon to its trunk that day, laughing with tired eyes. I looked at that tree now and felt tears slip down my cheek, not hot, not angry. Just slow and steady, like rain soaking into soil. I wasn't angry. I was heartbroken. Because betrayal from a stranger wounds the surface. But betrayal from your own child, that shatters the center. I stayed outside until the sun dipped low, until the air turned crisp and sharp. I didn't want them to see me. Not like that. When I came inside, the folder was gone. They must have realized I had seen it. Or maybe it was just a coincidence. But I noticed it was missing. And I never mentioned it. I didn't need to. Because something had settled inside me by then, something final. I wouldn't fight for their approval anymore. I wouldn't beg to be understood. I wouldn't try to soften my steps, so they'd forget I was there. They had already forgotten. No, worse. They had erased me. And now I would simply remove myself. On my own terms. With my name still on the deed, and my spine still straight. Not because I was vengeful, but because I had finally remembered who I was. Harold's wife. A mother who had given everything. A woman who had built this home. And I would not, could not, be gently pushed aside like a vase that no longer matched the decor. Not anymore. After that day, something in me stopped reaching. It wasn't a decision I made with loud intention. There was no grand moment of resolve. Just a quiet shift, like the tide pulling away from the shore, leaving behind what no longer needed to be held. I began to move differently in that house. I stopped waiting at the kitchen table in the mornings, hoping for someone to join me for tea. I drank it alone, in the sunroom, watching the same cardinal perch on the backyard fence. I stopped offering to help with dinner. I didn't comment on the groceries. I didn't ask about schedules or offer to pick up the twins. I let the days pass with their own rhythm, and I stopped trying to fold myself into the beat. No one asked why. Perhaps they liked it better that way. I started spending more time in my room, not as retreat, but as refuge. It felt sacred now, walls lined with small truths, photos of Harold, the quilt my mother stitched in patches of pink and blue, the copy of Little Women I had read to Mark when he was still small enough to curl into my lap. Each evening, I sat with my journal, not to record pain, but to collect clarity. I began writing not just memories but questions I had never allowed myself to ask. Why did I believe silence was the only safe path? Why did I confuse endurance with love? Why did I stay so long in rooms where my voice disappeared? It wasn't shame I felt. It was awakening. I watched Tina from a quiet distance now. She still moved with precision, always planning, always arranging. Her smiles were still tight, her voice still bright when guests were over. But I no longer leaned into her kindnesses because I saw them for what they were, performances. She was polite when she had to be, but never kind when no one was watching. And Mark became smaller in my eyes, not because I wanted him to, but because he let himself shrink. He avoided my gaze now, rarely lingered in rooms with me. He would place his coffee mug in the sink beside me and walk away, mumbling something about work or traffic. I didn't chase him. I didn't ask for talks. I had said what needed to be said in the letter. Anything more would be begging. I no longer begged. Even the children seemed to notice the change. Sarah lingered at my door one evening with a drawing she made, a house with flowers in the window. "It's yours," she said softly, and for the first time in weeks, my eyes watered without shame. I taped it to the wall above my dresser. It reminded me that I was still seen, even in fragments. The house around me continued its routine, busy mornings, cluttered afternoons, hushed conversations behind closed doors. I no longer eavesdropped. I no longer cared to decode the tones. I had one foot outside already. Not literally, but in spirit. The real estate agent sent me updates through quiet emails, one offer accepted, paperwork processing. I read them like one reads the forecast, calmly, practically. I made a checklist of what to take and what to leave. Not out of haste, not out of anger, but out of peace. I would take Harold's Bible, the box of photos, the quilt, the deed, now scanned and safely stored. I would leave the curtains Tina had picked out, the dining set Mark insisted on buying, the laughter that had long since moved out. I would leave the silence, the sharp kind that pierces more than it heals. But I kept one item hidden in my closet, the broken teacup, wrapped in a dish towel. Not because I couldn't let go of it, but because it reminded me of the exact moment I chose myself. Some days I would sit with it, fingers tracing the crack that split it neatly down the side. It wasn't beautiful anymore, but it was real, honest. Proof that something could break and still be held. And as the weeks slipped past, I stopped being afraid of what was coming. I didn't dread the conversation that would come when they realized the sale had gone through. I didn't flinch at the thought of moving, because I had already arrived at something far more important. Myself. I walked differently through the hallways now. Not loudly, but no longer apologetically. I didn't shrink when Tina sighed, or when Mark looked away. I didn't over-explain when I skipped dinner, or didn't come down for breakfast. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply done pretending I hadn't seen what I had seen, heard what I had heard, felt what I had felt. My silence was no longer submission. It was power. It was dignity. It was the sound of a woman reclaiming space within herself after years of giving it away in pieces. And for the first time in a long, long while, I slept through the night. Not because everything was right, but because I had stopped making excuses for what wasn't. The letter came in the mail on a Thursday. Thick paper, neat envelope, Joseph's firm yet familiar handwriting in the top left corner. I knew what it was before I opened it. I took it to the sunroom, where the light falls in long, warm beams just after midday. I held the envelope in my lap for a moment, letting its weight settle into my hands. When I opened it, I didn't feel triumphant. Just calm. The sale had gone through. Signed. Finalized. Irrevocable. The house was no longer ours. No longer mine, no longer theirs. And for the first time, that truth didn't feel like loss. It felt like freedom. I placed the letter inside the same old box that held the original deed and closed the lid with care, like tucking in an old friend. Then I reached for the second box in my closet, one I hadn't opened in years. It held Harold's journal, a simple leather-bound notebook, soft from years of handling. He had started it when we first married, writing little entries every few weeks, thoughts, memories, prayers. After he passed, I tucked it away. It felt too close then, too raw. But now I needed his voice again. Not to guide me, but to walk beside me, one last time. I opened to a random page somewhere near the middle. Built Margaret's bookshelf today. She said it wasn't necessary. But I like watching her place her books one by one, like they matter. I hope she always knows that she matters, even if no one tells her. I pressed my hand to the page. My eyes didn't fill with tears this time. They stayed steady, like my breath. I flipped to another. The house isn't the legacy. She is. That was the sentence I didn't know I had been waiting to hear. I sat there for a long while, the sun warming my shoulders, the journal resting open on my lap. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be small enough to be loved, quiet enough to keep peace, still enough to not cause waves. But Harold had seen me, long before the silence, long before the slap. He had seen me when I was just Margaret, the girl with calloused hands and a tender heart, trying to build something that would last. And somehow, through these pages, he was telling me that I had. Not in walls, not in paint, but in who I had become. Later that evening, Sarah knocked gently on my door. She held a shoebox wrapped in newspaper. "I made something," she said, her voice soft. I invited her in, and we sat on the edge of the bed together as she unwrapped it. Inside was a diorama, cut from cardboard and glued with the careful precision only a child's hands could manage. It was our house. Small, simple, with cotton ball clouds and tiny flowers made of paper. She pointed. "That's your window. The one with the yellow curtains. And that's the tree Papa Harold planted." I touched the tiny window with the tip of my finger. "It's beautiful," I whispered. She hesitated. "Are you leaving?" I looked at her face, so much like Mark's when he was small, before the weight of the world dulled his smile. "Yes, sweetheart," I said gently. "But I'll always be close. In all the ways that matter." She nodded, as if some part of her already knew. "I don't want them to forget you," she said. "They won't," I said. "Even if they try. Love doesn't disappear just because a door closes." She hugged me tight, her arms strong and sure. I kissed the top of her head and held her just a little longer than usual. After she left, I placed the diorama on my dresser, beside Harold's journal and the drawing she had given me earlier. It felt like a shrine, not to pain, but to remembrance. And I realized then I didn't need to be rescued. I already had everything I needed. Strength isn't always loud. It isn't in shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes, it's in the quiet unfolding of truth, the slow rising of self-worth, the kind that comes from surviving what others never even saw you suffer. That night, I wrote in my own journal. Today, I remembered who I was. I am not the walls. I am not the silence. I am the love that built both. And I will carry that with me, wherever I go. I closed the book, turned out the light, and slept with the window cracked open. The wind moved through the curtains like a lullaby, and I knew, without a doubt, that I was no longer waiting to be loved right. I had found my own way back to myself. To be continued. Have you ever found strength in moments of silence? Let me know. It began with the mail. A single white envelope, thick with official lettering, addressed to current residents, instead of our names. Tina opened it while standing near the kitchen sink, still in her work clothes. I watched from the hallway, folding a dish towel in half slowly, then again, my hands steady. Her eyes scanned the page, lips tightening. A small crease formed between her brows. She read it again, and again. Then she called out, not angrily, but sharp, like a command hidden behind confusion. "Mark." He came down the stairs, half-shaven, shirt wrinkled from where he'd fallen asleep in it. "What is it?" She handed him the letter without a word. I watched his eyes narrow. A flush climbed slowly up his neck. This isn't right," he said. I turned and walked back to my room before they saw me. I heard them arguing, muffled voices, tense and rising, not shouting but close. I couldn't hear every word, but I didn't need to. I had written them all in my mind weeks ago. She sold it? How could she? You said she didn't even have full control. You said the papers were never finalized. This can't be legal. There must be something we can do. I sat down on the edge of my bed and listened to their disbelief, their panic, the shifting of power, the slow realization that the woman they had once seen as fragile, forgetful, finished had moved quietly, completely, without asking permission. They hadn't seen it coming, because they never thought I could. By that evening, the tone had changed. Tina knocked on my door, then opened it before I answered. She stood in the doorway, arms folded tight. "You sold the house," she said, flat, each word clipped. I looked up from the small knitting project in my lap. "Yes." "To a stranger?" "No," I said softly. "To someone who values it." She blinked, thrown by the calm. I saw it, how she expected rage, guilt, maybe even tears. But I had already cried them. I had already buried the version of me who waited for their care. Mark appeared behind her, his voice quieter. "Ma, why?" I met his eyes. "You erased me before I ever left." He opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at the floor. "There are things we could have worked through." He tried again, weaker this time. "You try to take my name off the deed," I said, still quiet, still calm. "You wrote about putting me in a facility. You didn't ask. You planned." He rubbed his face with both hands. Tina stared at me like she was trying to translate a language she never bothered to learn. "The house, it was ours too," she said. "We made it better." "You painted over it," I replied. "That's not the same thing." And then I did what they never expected. I stood, slowly but with purpose. My back was straight, my shoulders soft but unshaking. "I'm leaving by the end of the week," I said. "The new owners take possession the following Monday. You'll need to be out by then, too." Tina's jaw dropped slightly. "You can't just..." But she stopped. "Because yes, I could." Mark whispered. "Where will you go?" "Somewhere I chose," I said. "Somewhere peaceful." They stood there, still as stone, not angry, just stunned. Like children watching the final petal fall from a flower they didn't realize was wilting. In the days that followed, the energy in the house shifted completely. They packed boxes quickly now, sharply. Doors closed harder. Dinners were quiet, barely a word passed. The children watched us all carefully, their young minds trying to understand the change they couldn't name. I made it easier for them. I sat with Eli and Sarah, pulled them close. "I'll be moving soon," I said gently. "But that doesn't mean I'm gone." Sarah looked up, eyes wet. "But why?" I touched her cheek. "Because sometimes grown-ups forget how to treat people gently. And when that happens, the best thing you can do is walk toward where you're loved." Eli nodded, like he understood more than he let on. I handed them each a small photo, one of them sitting on my lap, laughing years ago. "Keep this," I told them. "Remember that joy. That's what love is supposed to feel like." By Friday, the house was half empty. Tina didn't speak to me again. She moved like someone packing up not just belongings, but pride. Mark helped carry my things into the car the real estate agent arranged for me. He didn't say much, just looked at me with eyes that were heavier than before. "I didn't know," he murmured, one hand resting on the door. "I know," I said. That was the problem. I left before the sun set, the autumn light casting long shadows across the lawn. As we drove away, I looked back once, not at the house but at the tree in the yard. Harold's tree. Still standing. Still growing. And I thought, even when they cut the roots, the memory blooms. They would have to reckon with themselves now. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I had removed myself from their control. Sometimes, the greatest consequence is having to live with the weight of what you thought you could take from someone, only to realize you never really understood what they carried. The last day in the house came with no drama, just the sound of boxes scraping across the floor, cupboard doors opening and closing, and the occasional muted footsteps up and down the stairs. The tension hung like dust in the corners, settled but present. I had only a few things left to take: my journal, Harold's Bible, the framed photo of our wedding day, and Sarah's little diorama. My suitcase stood by the door, zipped and waiting. There was nothing frantic about it. I had folded every item carefully, each one chosen with intention. At noon, the car came to take me to my new place. Before I left, I walked through the house one final time, quietly, touching the walls as I passed, like saying goodbye to something that had once loved me, but no longer remembered how. I didn't cry. I had shed my tears in private, long before this day arrived. Tina and Mark were in the kitchen, surrounded by open drawers and half-packed containers. They paused when I entered. Tina stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Mark's eyes were tired, like someone who hadn't slept in days. I didn't rush. I stood in the doorway and looked at them both, not with anger, not with pity, but with the fullness of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the shape of regret, even when it was unspoken. "I'm leaving now," I said, my voice steady. Tina didn't respond. Mark took a slow step forward. "Ma, before you go, I just want to say..." I lifted my hand, gently. "I'm not here for apologies," I said. "I'm here to leave something behind." They looked at each other, unsure. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not legal, not official, just words written in my own hand, plain and direct. "I wrote this for you both," I said. "You can read it or not. That's up to you. But I want you to have it." Tina took it, cautiously, as if expecting it to bite. I waited a moment longer, then spoke again, this time not as a mother, not as a woman leaving a house, but as someone reclaiming the story that had nearly been written without her. "You built a life here," I said, "and I hope it brought you joy. But this house was never just walls and a roof. It was memory. It was sacrifice. It was love stitched into corners you never noticed." Mark lowered his eyes. "I poured years into this home, into all of you. I gave without keeping score. But when you tried to take it, quietly behind closed doors, what you really tried to take was my place in it." I stepped closer. "And that I won't ever allow again." Tina opened her mouth, but I stopped her with a glance. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm clear." Then I pulled from my pocket the smallest thing I had carried, a brass key. The original, the one Harold gave me the day we moved in. I had kept it all these years, though new locks had been installed since. I placed it on the counter between us. "This key doesn't open the door anymore," I said. But I kept it because it reminded me of who I was when I still believed this was home. I turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "One day," I said, "you'll look around and wonder when the house stopped feeling warm. And you might think it was the sale, or the change. But it wasn't." I looked back at them, soft but firm. "It was the day you stopped seeing me." Then I walked out. No one followed. Outside, the sun was warm against my back. The air smelled like earth and endings. I stepped into the car, my suitcase beside me, and didn't look back. As we drove away, I rested my hand on my lap, over Harold's journal. The house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, its windows glinting in the light. It looked the same, but it wasn't, and neither was I, because this final confrontation wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was simply truth, spoken without fear, carried without apology. A quiet claiming of dignity long overdue. The apartment was small, just 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen, but it was mine. The windows looked out over a quiet park, where children played after school and old couples walked their dogs on slow, thoughtful loops. There were flower beds along the sidewalks, maintained by volunteers from the community. I signed up the second week I moved in. I now tend the petunias every Thursday morning, wearing a sun hat and gloves, humming to myself like I used to when Harold worked beside me in the garden. There's a rhythm here that suits me. Simple, honest, gentle. No one here sees me as a burden. When I sit on the bench outside with my knitting, strangers smile and nod. The woman who lives across the hall, Rita, brings me tomatoes from her garden. The mailman waves every morning. The manager of the senior center 2 blocks away knows me by name. She tells me I remind her of her grandmother, and I don't correct her. I only smile. My room is filled with soft things. A yellow armchair by the window. A crocheted throw made by Sarah before she even knew how to count her stitches right. Books lined up on the shelf Harold built me, each one dusted and waiting. On the small round table beside my bed rests the diorama Sarah made, our old house in miniature, preserved in cardboard and glue. And beside it, always Harold's journal. I open it sometimes, not because I need answers, but because his handwriting still calms me. The house sold quickly. The new owners, kind, young, newly married, sent me a thank you card. They loved the hardwood floors, the view from the upstairs landing, the tree in the yard. They promised to keep the garden. They don't know the stories tucked into every corner, but maybe that's all right. A home can carry love, even if it's no longer yours. I heard Mark and Tina moved into a condo closer to Mark's work. We haven't spoken since the day I left. I don't wish them harm. I don't even wish them guilt. I wish them growth, the kind that comes slow and quietly, long after pride has softened into understanding. Sometimes Sarah writes to me, handwritten notes on bright stationery. She tells me about school, her friends, how much she misses our afternoons of storytelling. I write back, always. I tell her about the lady who sells fresh scones at the Sunday market, the poetry readings at the library, the birds that visit my window every morning like clockwork. Last week, Eli called. His voice had changed, deeper now. He said he found the picture I gave him tucked in his old backpack.
Said he'd been thinking about me.
I listened, heart full, letting his words settle like warm bread in my chest. Before hanging up, he said, I get it now. Why you left. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. The truth is, I didn't leave out of spite. I left to find myself again. And I did. In the quiet mornings when sunlight pools on my table. In the laughter shared with Rita over 2 sweet lemonade. In the stillness of my new home, where no one sighs when I speak. I have learned that peace doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it slips in through the back door, sits beside you without fanfare, and lets you exhale. I take walks in the early evening now, when the sky turns lavender and the street lamps begin to glow. I watch families gather at their dinner tables, see dogs stretched out on porches, hear the soft clink of dishes being washed. I no longer ache for what I lost, because what I found was far more precious. Myself. Not the woman who tiptoed through her own home, trying not to offend. Not the mother who silenced her heart to make room for others' comfort. But the woman who dared to speak, to step out, to begin again, softly, steadily, without apology. And I think if Harold were here, he'd take my hand and say, You did good, Margaret. You found your way. And I'd smile because I know I have. I have found something sweeter than comfort. I have found belonging, not in a house, but in my own skin. And for that I am grateful. The older I get, the more I understand that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it simply stands up and walks away without slamming the door. That house taught me so much about love, about giving, about silence. But in the end, it wasn't the house that shaped me. It was what I chose when the walls no longer held warmth, when the people no longer saw me, when love began to feel like erasure. I chose dignity, not revenge, not bitterness. Just quiet, clear, unwavering dignity. I live differently now. My days are slow, thoughtful. I water my plants in the morning, call friends in the afternoon, and watch the sunset with a heart no longer carrying weight that wasn't mine. Some evenings, I sit by the window with Harold's journal and let the memories come, not to haunt me, but to remind me how far I've walked. There are still moments, of course. Little aches. A birthday I'm not invited to. A photograph online with me cropped out. But even those pass through me like wind through leaves. I've learned not everything deserves a reaction. Some things only deserve release. If you've ever felt forgotten or unseen, I want you to know this. Your worth doesn't depend on how others treat you. It doesn't fade because someone refuses to see it. It lives quietly inside you, waiting, always waiting, for you to return to it. And when you do, when you finally stand in your own light, it is the softest, strongest feeling in the world. You are not what they failed to notice. You are what you choose to remember about yourself. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, remember, your worth doesn't depend on their understanding. Share your story in the comments.